So we thank Ian for holding on for 2 years. And it's a particular pleasure because of that to be here eventually in person and also on Zoom. I'd like to open our proceedings by saying a few words about this lecture series, a series that was set up in 2016 to celebrate in an ongoing way the remarkable life and work of Alison Winter, the historian of Britain, colleague at the University of Chicago, and family member and friend to many people in this audience here and also on Zoom as well. She was also at the time when she died, director of the Nicholson Center. A distinguished historian of science, she was the author of 2 extremely fine monographs on the history of the science of the mind. Mesmerized Powers of Mind in Victorian Britain was published in 1998, and Memory, Fragments of Modern History, that was awarded the Lang Prize in 2014. Her legacy lives on in her published work, but it also lives in the memories that people hold and the reputation that she continues to have, especially here at the University of Chicago. Although I was unlucky not to have known her personally, I have an extremely strong impression from listening to colleagues that she was an exceptional person, full of extraordinary energy and joie de vivre, a true force. One of her contributions, and one that I'm particularly grateful to her for, is that as director of the Nicholson Center, she institutionalized the expanded view of the scope of British studies, away from a narrow focus on the geography and history of the United Kingdom to one that takes in the vast scope of Britain's influence, for worse and for better, globally. One of Alison's legacies as director, therefore, has been to shift the perspective within British studies on our campus, very definitely to include Britain's legacies of empire and slavery. This has very much shaped the current work that the Centre does. Now, this will be the 4th Alison Winter lecture, and I welcome in our audience on Zoom former Winter lecturers who are able to be here through the magic of technology. I believe Simon Schaffer and Janet Brown. If you are here, you're very welcome. But my purpose in true University of Chicago style is to introduce the introducer, and the one who actually doesn't really need introducing at all because he is James Chandler. William B. Ogden, Distinguished Service Professor, the renowned scholar of Romanticism, of British literature, Scottish Enlightenment, and also of cinema studies. Although he's very much part of this university, this year he's absconded California and is a fellow at the Huntington Library. So we're particularly grateful to him for returning to these cold climes for this occasion. Jim's work is widely known, and I'm only going to mention one book because it's the one that's currently in press, probably to be called Doing Criticism Across Literary and Screen Arts, which will be out soon from OUP. It's especially fitting that Jim should be here as the introducer, because not only is he an affiliate and long-term friend and supporter of Nicholson, but because he was bonded to Alison in many ways, as her teacher, I believe, her colleague, a co-teacher with her, and of course, a good friend of many years. So after the lecture, just to say that there will be questions from the floor, but also on Zoom. So that's the technological obstacle that we're going to cross when we come to it. That's all for me. I'm going to pass on to Jim.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everybody here and there. I have been looking forward to welcoming Ian Duncan to speak here at the university for a long time. And it's especially satisfying to see him hosted under the auspices of the lecture founded to honor our beloved Alison Winter of cherished memory. Currently, Florence Green Bixby Distinguished Professor of English at Berkeley, Ian is the author of 3 major monographs and over 100 articles and essays, as well as editor of many important collections and scholarly editions. His education was at Cambridge, both BA and PhD, but before going to Berkeley, he taught at Yale and then at the University of Oregon, where in the mid-1990s, at a very tender age, he had held the Barbara and Carlyle Moore Distinguished Professorship of English. He is a notoriously generous colleague and a force for institutional good. He is also a great teacher, having won the Distinguished Teaching Award at Berkeley in 2017. He now, for his sins, is serving his second stint as department chair at Berkeley over the last 15 years or so. Very reluctantly, I might add. Ian's scholarship and criticism have been seminal in particular for the fields of 19th century fiction and Scottish studies. His first book, Modern Romance and Transformations of the Novel from Cambridge, was a shrewd intervention in the criticism of the novel. It was one of the first books to take seriously the oddity of the great fad for Gothic fiction in a British nation already so modern by the 1790s that it was already 2 decades into its first industrial revolution. His readings of Anne Radcliffe and Walter Scott and Charles Dickens, especially in relation to the strange archaism of their investments in the Gothic and this incredibly modernized culture, those readings were as good as anything anybody had written on those authors in a while. His next book, Scott's Shadow, the novel and romantic Edinburgh from Princeton, returned to Scott, but as part of a very different agenda. An effort to see in Scott's pioneering historical fiction both the expression of the culture of the so-called Athens of the North and a groundwork for things to come. This book does so many things so well that one really doesn't know where to begin praising it. For its critical virtuosity with the literary materials, for its clarity about the philosophical and intellectual historical issues, or for an elaboration of the Scottish Enlightenment in Edinburgh that pushes further into the 19th century than most scholars had been willing to go. In truth, its greatest strength is probably its capacity to move among these 3 different intellectual modes and to make them work together so well. A series of related essays, editions, and introductions that Ian published, both in anticipation of Scott's Shadow and also in the wake of it, extended his efforts to broaden and redefine a canon of British fiction that had long been accepted as relatively fixed. Beyond his transformative work on Scott himself, Ian has done a great deal to make writers like James Hogg, John Galt, Robert Louis Stevenson, and John Buchan more central to the study of the novel in Britain, even in Europe, with implications he has spelled out in detail in various settings. But the reason Ian is here for the Alison Winter lecture is because of the turn his work took next, as he moved toward the book that became Human Forms, the novel in the age of evolution, Princeton, 2019. The jacket blurb does not overstate things in calling it, quote, a major rethinking of the European novel and its relation to early evolutionary science. In this book, Scott and Dickens return yet again, but in new guises, along with Goethe, Germaine de Stael, Victor Hugo, and George Eliot. The crux of Ian's argument here lies in how he shows the dual impact of early evolutionary thinking in writers like Lamarck and Darwin on what Ian calls both the form of the human and the form of the novel. And the book's richness, I think, lies in how he elaborates this binary focus through the variety of its instantiations in 19th century fiction across Europe. He's currently working on several other projects, including the editing of the Cambridge History of Scottish Literature, but it looks as though his lecture for us today will revisit and extend some of the implications of his argument in that wonderful book of 2019. So please join me in welcoming Ian Duncan to speak to us today about Darwin's human history.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I want to thank Joe and Jean for taking such good care of me. I feel I've not, maybe this is part of the crawling out of our caves after 2 years of hibernation. I feel I've never been taken so well care of and welcomed. And I want to thank you all and thank Jim for that actually very moving and excessively generous introduction. Let me see, how can I get rid of that little, okay, easy as that. Okay, yeah, when I began thinking of writing Human Forms, I actually thought it would be a book on Darwin. And then I found myself getting more and more interested in the 100 years or so before Darwin of evolutionary or proto-evolutionary thought in the social sciences of the Enlightenment and the sort of nascent life sciences, the history of man. So I found myself, since that book came out, returning to Darwin as a figure I find obsessively interesting as a literary figure. And I should preface that by saying I'm approaching him as a literary scholar. What I want to talk about today is the genre of human history. In the last decade or so, we've seen the popular resurgence of a literary and scientific genre established in the late Enlightenment, the natural history of the human species. And I want to stress that these are works aimed at a popular general readership, some of them by scientists, accredited researchers like Darwin himself, as we shall see, others by public intellectuals, journalists, synthesizing work, not always perhaps as accurately or carefully as one could wish, from fields of scientific research. Following the success of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel 25 years ago, the current wave includes, and I'll be very selective, Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, Robert Boyd's A Different Kind of Animal, Rutger Bregman's Humankind, and 3 books published just last year, Leslie Nielsen and Peter Richardson's A Story of Us, Tom Hyam's The World Before Us, which I think has the best title with its intended or not sort of Miltonic resonance and its double meaning, and David Graeber, to bring a Chicago flavor to all this, David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. One has to admire the wonderful, like, late Enlightenment universalist scope of these titles. This last, the Graeber and Wengrow, mounting a powerful critique of the genre's earlier historiography, particularly as reaffirmed in the work of people like Diamond and Harari. Human natural history owes its appeal to what Hyam calls those most fundamental questions: where did we come from and how did we become human? Questions that are framed in turn by the ancient theme of human exceptionalism turned into a problem once human nature is cut off from metaphysical causes and embedded in terrestrial geography and history. What then? Thinkers from Rousseau, Kant, and Herder, through Lamarck and Darwin, to our contemporaries, keep asking, what makes us, in Boyd's phrase, a different kind of animal? And what does the difference amount to? I am struck by the persistence of answers offered by Enlightenment philosophical anthropology. Humans are endowed with an ontological excess, manifest as insatiable desire, Adam Ferguson, a propensity to exchange, Adam Smith, or an overflow of vital spirits in imaginative play, Friedrich Schiller. They are generalists, cognitively world-embracing, Herder, and have colonized the entire planet, Lamarck. Their dominance arises from large-scale social cooperation, sustained through sympathetic imitation and traditional transmission. And for these, we can go back to David Hume, Edmund Burke. Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man, which had its 150th anniversary last year, marked a decisive turning point since subsequent human histories have had to take on board the extension of Darwin's evolutionary thesis to our own species. The Descent of Man rewrites human difference as a historical question rather than an ontological one, and locates its crux at the developmental threshold of emergence from a pre-human state. What changed and what did not? What was lost and what gained when natural history became human history? One current answer, summarized by evolutionary anthropologist Robert Boyd, posits a temporal gear shift in which the accelerated time of cultural evolution overtakes the slow time of biological evolution. Working, according to Boyd, according to the same organic principles, but faster, culture outpaces and in certain instances may preempt biology. Whether or how far such a shift might amount to a qualitative change, such that human history breaks free, if only partially, from a prior natural history while yet remaining natural, is the question that continues to haunt modern thought, charged with meta-historical force, conditioning the histories of nations and civilizations. Human natural history maintains its hold on the popular imagination as well as on scientific inquiry, as is evident in the succession of universal histories in Darwin's wake. From H.G. Wells's 1920 blockbuster, The Outline of History, to the bestsellers of our own time. Sorry, why is this frozen? I need some technical help, I think. PowerPoint is frozen. Ah, there it is. Okay, it's just slow biological time, not fast cultural time. Strikingly, many of these histories I've skipped sorry, for some reason I skipped a slide. This is what happens when we use technology. So why isn't this going back? Does anybody know how this works better than I do? Ah, okay. Oh, we're back. All right, we're back.
That's not in the Zoom session. Fix one.
Okay, thanks.
Some folks on Zoom cannot see this right now. Escape. Zoom. And share
So
screen.
don't have any jokes or something.
Share screen. And so what is that? And what happened? What just happened? His screen just went entirely blank. His screen just went entirely blank.
Ah, there it is.
That's strange. Let's try that again. You have this set for presenter mode. Hold on one moment. This should not be happening.
Think of this as like a commercial.
So, where is your Zoom screen? This is very, very, very puzzling. Maximize this. There we go. And
People can still.
every time I go to put you in full screen, your screen goes blank.
We just do it without going full screen.
Yep. I just don't know how to make it come back.
Huh.
There we go. And let's just make it a little larger. That'll do.
Okay. Is that all right? Let me just stretch the edges of it so it's not. How about we do that? Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah. Yeah. Strikingly. Let me get rid of that. Okay. Strikingly, many of these histories recast the evolutionary transition between pre-human and human states as a revolutionary transition, a great leap forward, Diamond, a human revolution, Richard Klein, the point when history declared its independence from biology, Harari. Such formulations defy Darwin's gradualist principle, natura non facit saltum, nature does not leap, more brazenly than the hypothesis of an organic process common to the disparate temporal scales of biological and cultural development. Given the authority of Darwin's evolutionary thesis, it's worth asking then what kind of human history and what account of the transition from a pre-human to a human condition we can read in The Descent of Man. The book's original hypothesis of a human evolutionary principle is sexual selection according to aesthetic criteria, rather than rational choice reckonings of fitness, which humans share with other creatures. Once humans have established ecological dominance, transformed their material environment, and in effect domesticated themselves, sexual selection becomes the main driver of physical diversity, generating the signs of racial difference as well as gender dimorphism. It affords a synchronic rather than a historical view of the continuity across human and non-human animal life, as well as across human racial differences, a continuity that is sustained rather than broken up by formal variation. There is a history of human emergence to be read in The Descent of Man, but it's cryptic, legible in gaps and pieces rather than through a continuous sequence. As in The Origin of Species, Darwin eschews a narrative organization of his argument, which had made earlier evolutionist theses, such as those by Herder or Robert Chambers, vulnerable to dismissal as works of conjectural history, more fiction than science or philosophy. The pressure points of Darwin's human history are the cognitive and ethical faculties, or rather the relation between them. Here, upon reason and morality, claims for human uniqueness keep being urged in persistent attempts to reinstall an essential difference between ourselves and other creatures. Here too, Darwin stakes his account of a moral or cultural achievement of full humanity in the form of a universal extension of sympathy to all sentient beings. The achievement is at odds with the biopolitical imperative of human ascendancy, according to the logic of natural selection, manifest in the march of European empires, laying waste to regional ecologies and indigenous populations. Recent proponents of the human revolution thesis revert to the fault line in Darwin's account, with the argument that the revolutionary rise of Homo sapiens entailed the mass extinction of other species, including other human species. Yuval Noah Harari identifies fiction, the imaginary construction of non-existent states, as the secret weapon in modern humans' cognitive revolution, enabling our displacement of rival hominin populations. Harari's claim carries a faint, distorted echo of Darwin's conjectural history of the evolution of the moral sense through the work of the imagination, richly nourished in The Descent of Man by the resources of the 19th century novel. In what follows, I'll reconstruct Darwin's evolutionary argument, consider the apparent contradiction that drives it, and then briefly consider conjectural natural histories of humankind in Darwin's wake, culminating in last year's compelling turn against the human revolution thesis, mounted from the disciplinary fields of social anthropology and comparative archaeology. Okay, now it's... okay. In The Descent of Man, Darwin dismantles the barriers that have traditionally divided human beings from other animals, especially the cognitive barriers. There is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties, he writes. The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. The argument comes most strenuously to bear on reason and morality, the favored properties invoked to divide man from the brutes. Darwin has little trouble marshalling evidence for a rational faculty in other animals. But when it comes to the moral sense, his argument grows more tortuous until a difference in degree widens into something very like a difference in kind. I fully subscribe to the judgment of those writers who maintain that of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is by far the most important, such that man alone can with certainty be ranked as a moral being. It seems there is a threshold that must be crossed for humanity to come fully into its own. Darwin lays out a conjectural sequence of evolutionary steps through which the human forms of morality arose from pre-human social instincts which bond together all creatures that live in swarms, shoals, or packs. Firstly, the social instincts lead an animal to take pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, and to perform various services for them. Secondly, as soon as the mental faculties had become highly developed, images of all past actions and motives would be incessantly passing through the brain of each individual. And that feeling of dissatisfaction or even misery, which invariably results from any unsatisfied instinct, would arise, as often as it was perceived that the enduring and always present social instinct had yielded to some other instinct, at the time stronger, but neither enduring in its nature, nor leaving behind it a very vivid impression. It is clear that many instinctive desires, such as that of hunger, are in their nature of short duration, and after being satisfied, are not readily or vividly recalled. The threshold stage, there are two more stages, but the one I want to focus on, I think the critical threshold stage here, is the second, in which a cognitive faculty, the ability to reflect upon past actions and motives, converts an instinctive sympathy into moral deliberation. At that stage, instinct bifurcates along two concurrent tracks, each of which affords a different subjective relation to time. Appetitive instincts such as hunger are bound to the body and the fleeting present moment. The social instinct becomes morally efficacious through our ability to imagine past states and compare them with the present, an operation which expands the present into an enduring state from which we can project and regulate potential futures. A moral being is one who is capable of comparing his past and future actions or motives and of approving or disapproving of them. Darwin's conjectural history of morality resonates with recent neurobiological studies of what's called mental time travel. MRI scans show that the same area of the brain, the hippocampus, processes our memories of past events and also our projections of futurity. Episodic memory, the ability to mentally visit and inhabit the past, turns out to be crucial to the modeling of possible futures, since it involves a conscious act of construction rather than a faithful enactment of the past. Mental time travel, the imaginative combination of past, present, and future states to form a durational continuum, thus refines the social instinct into the moral sense or conscience. In another recent popular synthesis, this time a natural history of cognition rather than of humans, philosopher of science Peter Godfrey Smith argues that many kinds of animals, some of them remote from us on the evolutionary tree, are capable of offline processing, a capacity that can be directed forward, backward, or sideways, temporally speaking, into alternative presents. What makes human cognition distinctive, Godfrey Smith proposes, is something psychologists call executive control, the ability to direct oneself on a task, suppress momentary urges, and marshal one's various abilities in pursuit of a consciously represented goal. Or as Darwin puts it, in the case of man, who alone can with certainty be ranked as a moral being, actions of a certain class are called moral, whether performed deliberately after a struggle with opposing motives, or impulsively through instinct, or from the effects of slowly gained habit. Since other animals, as well as ourselves, can perform moral actions impulsively through inherited instinct or learned habit, what distinguishes human conscience is the deliberation of the moral act, executive control, through a struggle with opposing motives. Internal conflict is the stigma of human nature. Humans, in effect, inhabit a double temporality, subjectively divided between the sensuous, perishable present, the time of the individual body, its sense impressions and urges, and the combinatory, durational time of the imagination, which is attuned to social life and its abstract networks of custom and law, sanction and reward. Darwin's conception of the production of the moral sense through mental time travel and the resulting duality of human consciousness trails a long theological and moral philosophical genealogy, and also a rich literary genealogy. The most nuanced explorations of his hypothesis can be found in 19th century novels, including some he's likely to have read, and Darwin's reading of 19th century fiction is well documented from Julian Beer, George Levine, and others onwards. The Mill on the Floss, the novel George Eliot was writing when she read On the Origin of Species, might have provided Darwin with his model for the generation of the moral sense through a conflict between natural instincts keyed to different temporal states. Eliot's heroine, Maggie Tulliver, defends her sense of duty, ethically binding the present to past and future, against her lover's complaints that it is unnatural. Love is natural, Maggie rejoins, but surely pity and faithfulness and memory are natural too. And they would live in me still and punish me if I did not obey them. I should be haunted by the suffering I had caused. One of her suitors insists the feeling which draws us towards each other is too strong to be overcome. That natural law surmounts every other. And Maggie replies, if the past is not to bind us, where can duty lie? We should have no law but the inclination of the moment. Her responses articulate that feeling of dissatisfaction or even misery in Darwin's formulation that must follow the sacrifice of the enduring and always present social instinct to a momentary desire. The imaginative capacity to inhabit different temporal states is key to an earlier classic of English realism, Jane Austen's Emma, and we know from Darwin's letters back home to his sisters back home from HMS Beagle that he was an early and avid Janeite. He casts himself as poor Dick Musgrove and Captain Fitzroy as the glamorous Captain Wentworth in his letters to his sisters. Austen's heroines are, of course, famous for being able to recall and reassess their prior histories, and through that reflection, achieve a moral reformation which justifies their status as novelistic protagonists. Emma Woodhouse considers her relationship with Frank Churchill. Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to the how much. At first, she thought it was a good deal, and afterwards, but little. She was very often thinking of Frank and quite impatient for a letter that she might know how he was, how were his spirits, how was his aunt, and what was the chance of his coming to Randalls again this spring. But on the other hand, she could not admit herself to be unhappy, nor after the first meeting, to be less disposed for employment than usual. She was still busy and cheerful, and pleasing as he was, she could yet imagine him to have faults, and farther, though thinking of him so much, and as she sat drawing or working, forming 1,000 amusing schemes for the progress and close of their attachment, fancying interesting dialogues and inventing elegant letters, the conclusion of every imaginary declaration on his side was that she refused him. As well as contemplating past and present, Emma imagines possible, conjectural, hypothetical states in order to arrive at a moral deliberation and become, in effect, the author of her own story. In this case, in other words, she is thinking like a novelist, like the novelist in whose novel she plays the leading role. In this case, her novelistic imagining is more authentically deliberative than her misguided attempts to plot the lives of her neighbors. Besides Emma, nearly all the other characters appear flat, deficient in psychological and moral depth, incapable of reflection or development, stuck in an eternal present of automatic reflex or animal instinct, cut off, unlike Emma, from the higher cognitive plane of Austen's narration. Emma is, we might say, more fully human than they are, faultless in spite of all her faults, or rather, because of them. Emma's imaginative capability then comprises mental time travel, not only to past states and thence to projected future states, but also to non-existent, potential, even counterfactual states. Future projections are generated through conditional and subjunctive timelines. The conclusion of every imaginary declaration on his side was that she refused him. Empirical studies of cognition recognize this affordance of conjectural as well as remembered temporalities. Just as a playwright is responsible for creating new stories, mental simulations of novel future events require open-ended generativity. Our ability to combine and recombine a limited set of items into virtually unlimited ways. It may be the generative component that most clearly distinguishes mental time travel in humans from future directed capacities in other species. The authors describe an imaginary projection of potential realities as opposed to the representation of a reality already in place. In other words, an act of fiction. Although not dwelling on this fictive turn, Darwin had characterized the formation of the moral sense as, in the first place, an imaginative operation in which, his phrase, images of all past actions and motives are incessantly passing through the brain as the matrix of rational deliberation and choice. Biological anthropologist Agustin Fuentes characterizes the human capacity to move between the worlds of what is and what could be as crucial to human evolutionary emergence, above all, to what evolutionary biologists call niche construction, whereby a species reshapes its material environment to accommodate its evolving needs. In the case of our species, niche construction knows no bounds. It is the signal operation of what Heidegger called humans' world-forming, weltbildende drive. The subtitle of Fuentes' 2017 book, How Imagination Made Humans Exceptional, highlights what's at stake here. The imaginative capacity to project possible worlds is not only intrinsic to human nature, but in these accounts unique to it. The badge of human exceptionalism, driver of a revolutionary rather than evolutionary emergence of our species in natural history. This comprises the evolutionary argument of Harari's Sapiens. Human emergence and our species' ascendancy over other collateral human populations, as well as all other forms of life, terrestrial life, is made possible by a qualitative leap forward in human mental capacity, a cognitive revolution. And he gets this from Richard Klein and earlier authors. If the cause of the cognitive revolution is that magic bullet, a change in DNA, which can explain anything, right? Its key technology turns out to be fiction. Humans were able to become fully human 70,000 years ago because they alone could imagine things that do not really exist. The capacity to make up a fiction and crucially to get others to believe in it generates collective life on a large scale beyond the face-to-face community of the band or tribe, an order of magnitude necessary to launch civilizations, states, and empires. A society of strangers needs a shared mythology, a religion, or ideology for it to cohere and act together and overcome less organized competitors for territory and resources. Harari's is a crudely instrumental conception of fiction as an imagined reality that everyone believes in. We can compare it with the sophisticated literary anthropology of Wolfgang Iser in his late work, The Fictive and the Imaginary, a book that's not much read now, but repays serious reading, and it does demand serious reading. It has a properly Teutonic kind of density and thoroughness. But it's a brilliant book to go back to. Iser distinguishes between this kind of fiction, the Harari version, which conceals its fictive status in a bid to take the place of reality, and a literary fiction which advertises its fictive status through conventional signs, so that we know as we're reading or watching that this is just a fiction. Ideologies and institutions subsume reality so as to claim reality's semblance, whereas a novel or drama, in Iser's phrase, simultaneously disrupts and doubles the referential world, releasing the referential world into the indeterminacy of the imaginary, endowing imaginary states and entities with the concreteness, the embodied sensuous life of empirical reality, keeping both in play in a relation of mutual critical reflection. Darwin does not pause to consider the ontological condition of imaginary states in his own conjectural history of human emergence. He goes on instead to project a future history of the species in which humanity comes into its own, becomes fully human through a continuous evolution of the moral sense. If sympathy for fellow members of the pack constitutes the social instinct in pre-human animals, its human development takes place by a deliberative expansion beyond the local group and ultimately beyond humankind altogether. As man advances in civilization and small tribes united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. Sympathy beyond the confines of man, that is, humanity, the word appears here, to the lower animals, seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. This virtue, one of the noblest with which man is endowed, seems to arise incidentally from our sympathies becoming more tender and more widely diffused until they are extended to all sentient beings. Humanity, the plenitude of our species being, refers not to a biological condition, but to a moral one. It is the product of a cultural rather than biological development achieved through the imaginative capacity to cross species boundaries and extend our sympathy to all sentient beings. Darwin reiterates this conjectural history as man gradually advanced in intellectual power and his sympathies became more tender and widely diffused, extending to men of all races, to the imbecile, maimed, and other useless members of society, and finally to the lower animals. So would the standard of his morality rise higher and higher. The prescription carries rhetorical force. If sympathy with the lower animals is a token of moral advancement, then we ought to be able to accept the general argument of the descent of man that we are also genetically kin to them. Here then, we find Darwin reiterating the plan of a Bildung der Humanität, a formation of humanity, or complete realization of human nature, advanced by Herder, Kant, Schiller, and other late Enlightenment philosophers. Darwin's version assumes the moral imperative of sympathy, formulated by British thinkers such as Adam Smith, and adopted as the ethical burden of much Victorian fiction, most programmatically by George Eliot. Elsewhere in The Descent of Man, however, another projection of future human history vexes the scenario of a universal empire of sympathy. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon instead of, as now, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Darwin's prognosis, so chilling for its calm delivery, erases the distinction between human races and anthropoid species, along with the living beings in question. How may we reconcile Darwin's forecast of future exterminations with his vision of a perfection of humanity through the deliberative expansion of sympathy to men of all races, and beyond them, all sentient beings? Extermination, it turns out, paves the way to that ethical utopia. Immediately before the forecast, oops, I skipped one. Here we go. Immediately before this forecast, Darwin admits that the great break in the organic chain between man and his nearest allies, which cannot be bridged over by any extinct or living species, has often been advanced as a grave objection to the belief that man is descended from some lower form. The general principle of evolution, however, not only permits but determines such breaks in the organic series, some wide, sharp, and defined, and others less so, depending on the number of related forms which have become extinct. The difference between man and the rest of the animal kingdom, the quality of human uniqueness, is thus a phenomenological illusion, a product of historical contingency, in the form of the extinction gap that presently separates the Negro Australian from the gorilla, and that will keep opening until it divides the hyper-civilized air of the Caucasian from some ape as low as a baboon. Darwin had explained the general principle in The Origin of Species. The competition will generally be most severe between those forms which are most nearly related to each other in habits, constitution, and structure. Hence, all the intermediate forms between the earlier and later states, that is, between the less and more improved states of the same species, as well as the original parent species itself, will generally tend to become extinct. So it probably will be with many whole collateral lines of descent, which will be conquered by later and improved lines. Darwin is writing, of course, at the height of worldwide British colonial expansion. It may be the case that with the establishment of civil society, only an artificial barrier prevents our sympathies from extending to men of all races. But, Darwin adds, if such men are separated from us by great differences in appearance or habits, experience unfortunately shows us how long it is before we look at them as our fellow creatures. As several commentators have noted, most recently Evelyn Richards, in a magisterial study of the making of sexual selection, Darwin is recalling his own reactions of horror and disgust on viewing the indigenous inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego 40 years earlier on the voyage of the Beagle, an aesthetic shock he rhetorically stages at the close of the Descent of Man as visceral, irreducible, organic. It seems that the pace of imperial progress and the attendant struggle over territory and resources will outrun the time needed to naturalize a sympathetic recognition of strange others. In a startling upset of the ratio of cultural evolution to biological evolution that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, it seems that instinctive hatred will ride the revolutionary tempo of human history's great leap forward, while the development of the moral sense crawls along in the slow time of a gradualist natural history. Our aversion to hideous close relatives expresses our recognition of them as ecological competitors, the more intransigently different for being almost but not quite the same as us. Their extermination is the condition for that final dilation of fellow feeling across the horizon of being, which signifies our achievement of a full, authentic humanity. It completes, by literalizing, the symbolic operation Sylvia Winter has called overrepresentation, by which a particular ethnoclass, in this case the Caucasian or his hyper-civilized descendant, comes to stand for the human species as such. In Darwin's vision, that literally becomes the case after several centuries. Darwin's human history plays out, my too trigger happy there. Darwin's human history plays out with bleak clarity, antithetical strains of the Enlightenment dream of a self-determining, self-making, world-forming human nature, liberated from archaic biological as well as theological constraints to expand indefinitely across the earth, covering it with a universal empire of fellow feeling, necessitating, however, the eradication of closely related forms of life with which we're locked in a structural antagonism. In order to reconsider the apparent fatalism of this human natural history, though, I'll turn now in the closing section of my talk to some influential versions written in Darwin's wake and trace the theme of a progressive history articulated upon the replacement of supposedly less developed, or improved, to use Darwin's terms, by more developed races and peoples. That history gains force by being retrojected into prehistory, that time of origins, when it seems those most fundamental of questions, where did we come from and how did we become human, can not only be asked, but answered. Recent iterations of the human revolution thesis, including Diamond's and Harari's, relocate Darwin's scenario of the replacement of, quote, savage by, quote, civilized races back into human prehistory. The scenario was popularized, maybe definitively, by H.G. Wells in The Outline of History, 1919 to 1920, and one of the most influential books of its time. The appearance of the first truly human post-glacial Paleolithic peoples, Cro-Magnons, Wells writes, was certainly an enormous leap forward in the history of mankind. They dispossessed Homo neanderthalensis from his caverns and his stone quarries. And they agreed with modern ethnologists, it would seem, in regarding him as a different species. Unlike most savage conquerors who take the women of the defeated side for their own and interbreed with them, it would seem that the true men would have nothing to do with the Neanderthal race, women or men. Wells makes genocide the corollary of the enormous leap forward and finds it encoded psychologically, affectively, in an instinctive aesthetic response of racial hatred. We know nothing of the appearance of Neanderthal man, but this absence of intermixture seems to suggest an extreme hairiness, an ugliness, or repulsive strangeness in his appearance, over and above his low forehead, his beetle brows, his ape neck, and his inferior stature, or he and she may have been too fierce to tame. Darwin's hypothesis of an aesthetic principle of sexual selection, the motive force of human evolution, hardens here into a grim determinant of species, of the division of species. Insurmountable aversion secures the border between a relatively fluid and porous racial difference and a rigid, intransigent species difference. We find these quasi-humans too repulsive to interbreed with, to love, so we destroy them. After the Neanderthal extinction, Wells writes, there is no great break, no further sweeping away of one kind of man and replacement by another kind between the appearance of the Neolithic way of living and our own time. Invasions, conquests, and mass migrations follow, but the human species inhabits a continuous history. There is no real break in culture from their time onward until we reach the age of coal, steam, and power-driven machinery that began in the 18th century, the age of total human dominion over the earth, lately called the Anthropocene. Wells's enormous leap forward anticipates Jared Diamond's great leap forward, but without the sort of Maoist spin on the term, in which human territorial expansion into Australasia and the Americas caused mass extinction spasms of Pleistocene megafauna. Diamond mentions only in passing the displacement of Neanderthals in Europe by Homo sapiens. But the disappearance of the 5 and counting other known hominin species, and this is another development really of the last 10 or 15 years, the disappearance of the 5 other known hominin species that shared the planet with us in our early history is the key event in Harari's cognitive revolution. Our sudden jump to the top of the food chain made us into gangster-like arrivists, in contrast to majestic top predators such as lions, who, co-evolving with their prey species, inhabit an aristocratic genealogy of evolutionary slow time. This is Harari. Having so recently been one of the underdogs of the savannah, we are full of fears and anxieties over our position, which makes us doubly cruel and dangerous. The fiction-making superpower that gives us overwhelming capacity for collective action issued in the genocide of our cousin species, the signature of human global ascendancy, our bloody thumbprint in the fossil record. Or perhaps not, since that signature consists of an absence of evidence, a disappearance, for which paleoanthropologists have proposed other causes. Arguing that the hominin extermination thesis lacks archaeological proof, Rutger Bregman proposes instead a hopeful history of human ascent, according to which our superior capacity to socialize evolved not through the weaponizing of fiction, but selection according to friendliness, and a progressive acquisition of cute, childlike features, a Disneyfication of the human physiognomy. Bregman's awful nickname for our species, Homo puppy, offers a cuddly riposte to Harari's ruthless killer ape. In much the same way, Desmond Morris's Sexy Naked Ape, 1967, was a hippie-era riposte to the Cold War angry ape of Robert Ardrey in another widely read conjectural anthropology. Natural man, both cases assume the masculine gender, natural man arrives in Ardrey's account as always already a settler colonist grabbing and defending property. Whereas in Morris's, he comes into his own with the liberation of sensuous skin from bestial pelt. Wells identified the moral and political impetus for his outline of history in the carnage of the First World War. A common human history would provide the script, Wells hoped, for the universal sympathy Darwin had imagined future humanity marching towards across the killing fields of empire. A few decades later, Cold War scenarios of nuclear annihilation would give a fresh impulse to the writing of human natural history, as in the examples of Ardrey and Morris, as well as to ancillary new disciplines such as ethology, sociobiology, and evolutionary psychology. Now, in the shadow of biosphere-scale disaster, mass extinctions, civilizational and ecological collapse, the genre flourishes again. We can only speculate as to the pressure of historical conditions on the current turn human natural history is taking. I'll consider this turn by looking very briefly now at the 2021 books by Hyam and by Graeber and Wengrow, synthesizing recent discoveries in paleoarchaeology, paleoanthropology. These mount a strong rebuttal of the human revolution thesis, insisting that no single event and no original form of society or of natural man defined the emergence of modern human beings. Hyam refutes the Neanderthal replacement scenario. Far from vanishing in a sudden extinction spasm, other hominin populations, Denisovan as well as Neanderthal, coexisted with us for at least 10,000 years. Recent archaeological findings and DNA analysis indicate a mosaic of human groups, geographically separated, but meeting and interbreeding occasionally, exchanging artifacts and knowledge as well as genes. In eras of extreme climate variation, Homo sapiens' capacity to socialize and mix on a large scale may have sustained the species, while other hominin populations, smaller and more isolated, lacked sufficient genetic diversity to perpetuate themselves. Hyam writes, our success in evolutionary terms has been sharpened considerably due to our hybridizing tendency, cultural as well as biological, rather than the capacity to weaponize our imagination. Reconstructing early human history rather than human prehistory, Graeber and Wengrow are explicit about the political stakes of their project, a new history of humankind that seeks to restore our ancestors to their full humanity and rediscover the freedoms that made us human in the first place. Those freedoms have been constrained by the determinism of the linear historiography of progressive historical stages, ascending from simple to complex forms of organization that govern the succession of modes of subsistence, according to Enlightenment social history, Scotland and elsewhere, became a principle of organic development in the German Romantic life sciences and was imported back into human social history, fitting it with an inner biological drive by Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, and their followers. Against this, Graeber and Wengrow propose an analog to Hyam's mosaic model of a widespread miscellaneous diversity of human populations coexisting and interacting. They posit a mixture of radically different practices of social and political organization, even synchronically within the same population in early human history, rather than, for instance, a teleological succession of nomadic pastoralism by agricultural settlement, or the inexorable formation of a central state once people gather in cities. What really makes us human in the first place, they write, is our capacity as moral and social beings to negotiate between social and political alternatives. Here, Graeber and Wengrow reaffirm a vision of human nature formulated once more in late Enlightenment philosophical anthropology, the optimistic humanism of Kant and Herder, for whom we are beings with the capacity for self-creation, even freedom, overcoming biological fatality. I hear a particular resonance with Friedrich Schiller's on the aesthetic education of man. In Graeber and Wengrow's claim that humans are creatures of excess, manifest in a capacity for imaginative play. Man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, and he is only fully a human being when he plays, writes Schiller. Graeber and Wengrow, human beings are fundamentally imaginative creatures for whom, time and again in human history, a zone of ritual play has also acted as a site of social experimentation, even in some ways as an encyclopedia of social possibilities. Schiller's play drive, a spontaneous overflow of imaginative energies exceeding utilitarian applications, is the generator of proliferating open-ended experiments in the limitless ways and forms of human collective life. Now, I am not competent to evaluate the scientific plausibility of these accounts of human nature and human history. What I do want to do in closing now is consider how they might orient us towards ways of reading The Descent of Man, and more generally, reading literature from earlier generations of our own increasingly fraught modern history, especially literature that makes claims on human nature and its constituent categories such as race. Readings of Darwin have been notably constrained by just the sort of fatalistic stadial historiography that Graeber and Wengrow seek to refute, so that the moral and political potentials of The Descent of Man are determined by the grim history of empire, war, and genocide that unfolds around it and in its wake. But social Darwinism, white supremacy, replacement theory, and by the way, Harari uses that word, that term, and the rest may no more be inevitable outcomes of reading The Descent of Man than the historical retraction of our political freedoms, according to Graeber and Wengrow, is an inevitable outcome of early forms of social organization. Alongside the dire forecast of future extermination, Darwin inserts vivid catalogues in The Descent of Man of the norms of beauty among so-called savage peoples, expressed in the extravagant variety of human preferences for skin color, hairstyle, artificial adornment, and bodily modification, which he draws from contemporary ethnographies and travelogues. Aesthetic preference, taste, is the motive force of sexual selection, we recall, the cosmetic principle that generates diversification of the races of man. Destabilizing and decentering European norms of beauty, Darwin's festive catalogues solicit our recognition of the relativity of aesthetic judgment across human populations and generations. These passages pose a pedagogical challenge to Darwin's readers, as they bring the aesthetic sense into focus as the crux of the moral sense. Our judgments of beauty, what we find attractive and what not, are the basis of our moral judgments as to whom we find ourselves able to love, respect, or tolerate. Can we, honorary Victorians, learn to relish, even embrace the wild exuberance of human diversity? Or shall we cling to our provincial revulsion, much as H.G. Wells's early humans recoiled in horror from their Neanderthal neighbors? Recent research shows, after all, that they did not, and that both are our ancestors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So I'm going to open it up for questions. But can I look on your Zoom to see whether there are any in the chat? Do we have anyone on Zoom? I'm not sure.
Do we stop? Yeah.
I'll look at that.
Okay.
Maybe I can use Jean's. But in the meantime, I open questions. If anyone has a question.
My dissertation directing me, the first time I went to a conference when I was a graduate student, always plant the first question.
Okay, thank you.
You put the emphasis on imagination as a source of the moral sense for Darwin. What about natural selection?
Yeah, no, great question, because of course, well, let me rephrase that. Yeah, I think what I sense reading The Descent of Man is a tension between what I've called the biopolitical logic of natural selection, which is evident in these sort of exterminating events of replacement that Darwin forecasts in the future. And he himself was witness to in The Voyage of the Beagle, right? He rides with General Rosas's troops in the Argentine as they're getting rid of the Pampas Indians, wiping out the Pampas Indians. Darwin makes landfall in Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania just a few years after they deported the last of indigenous peoples off to I forget which island where they then perish. So he's fully aware of these sort of genocidal events as events in human history.
Not that he approves of them.
No, not at all. And what I'm trying to avoid, what I'm trying to draw attention to is I think the tension within Darwin. For him, the moral sense is a cultural production after it hits a certain level, right? Once Darwin talks about human beings as the only species that have effectively domesticated themselves, right? By, in effect, controlling, reshaping our environments, we lessen the kind of brutal determination of the forces that amount to natural selection in other species. And so sexual selection actually moves to the foreground. It's a sort of ancillary operation in other creatures. But with humans, it sort of comes to the foreground, and it's once we become Homo sapiens for Darwin, that's what generates distinctions between races, and indeed what he calls the secondary sexual characters. They're based on aesthetic preference. There's a recent book by Richard Prum, who's an ornithologist, who he actually makes the argument, which I don't find plausible, but people who know more about this, the science of it, will agree or disagree. He actually makes the point that sexual selection and natural selection end up being two different drives in the later Darwin, which I think exaggerates and gets rid of, I think, the dialectical force of Darwin's thinking. So I think Darwin would, he would want, it's not that he at all approves of extermination, he would very much want to see this extension of sympathy overcoming our provincial prejudices and racisms.
Well, what I had in mind is his notion of group selection, which he emphasizes in the dissent as the source of the human moral capacity.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and that's linked to what he calls the social instinct, right? But sorry.
Well, it's actually a biological situation. It's not a cultural one.
Right.
It's cultural in the sense that we respond to our group in cooperative ways, and those groups that have more cooperators are likely to win in the battle against each other. And that will solidify the notion of patriotism, cooperation, courage, and so forth.
Right.
So those are the sources, but they're very human sources.
Right. Yeah. And of course, Darwin, there's all sorts of scientific knowledge and information we now have, which we didn't have access to about precisely how those things work. But his emphasis on this extension of sympathy beyond the group, right, I think is what's key and interesting and kind of utopian. What I'm trying to do is focus on what's utopian in Darwin's thought, rather than turning Darwin into a social Darwinist, which I don't think he was.
Well, he is a social Darwinist after all. He applies evolutionary theory to society.
Right, but social Darwinist in the grim, sort of genocidal sense that develops after him. Yeah, there are passages in The Descent of Man that are very chilling, where he says at one point, of course, the unfit should not breed in a population, right? But then he also says, but we cannot legislate that politically because it would do violence to our sympathies, right? It would make us cold and unsympathetic and unfeeling, and sympathy is for him the moral basis of the healthy functioning of a group. So there's a very interesting point, I think, where we see Darwin kind of confronting the tension between these impulses.
There's another question, Lee.
Yeah, picking up on the non-survival of the fittest, which I think he gets from William Rathbone Gregg. I'm wondering about how artificial selection plays into your sort of utopian reading of Darwin, as the strange, like Malthusian morality has prevented the middle class from breeding. And so that ends up with a problem for the English race, at least.
That's right. Yeah, we have, what is it, the degenerate drunken Irishman.
Right.
Overbreeding and the abstemious Scot.
Exactly, the Scot.
Original Scots don't breed enough. Yeah, again, one of the sort of Victorian curlicues to his argument. Yeah, I mean, of course, he opens the Origin of Species, the chapter on artificial selection. Partly does that rhetorically. This is something that all his readers will accept. But it's fascinating to find the argument about artificial selection re-emerging in The Descent of Man. I mean, in the Origin, he makes it very clear that artificial selection is aesthetically motivated, right? He talks about breeders don't select breed with some sort of long-term view of what the fittest version of this particular domestic animal is going to be. They just assess whatever the local variations are. It's essentially an aesthetic principle. He talks about farmers like connoisseurs looking at breeds of sheep, and he actually uses a kind of connoisseurial language. And what I read in The Descent of Man is, again, is this notion of self-domestication, right? As what begins to make a difference in degree, but that functionally, if not categorically, is beginning to operate like a difference in kind. That because we model our environments and make our own decisions about who we breed with and what the grounds of attractiveness are when we're not driven by some demiurgic superpower, we are more like domestic animals, but also are performing the function of breeders, right? I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, it just seems like a point where the moral freedom of man ends up alienating him from potentially an authentic aesthetic set of norms. But
yeah, I think again, to me, one of the most moving things in The Descent of Man is the way Darwin gets rid of any sense of aesthetic norms, right? He says, humans like animal breeders, we like fine degrees of difference. We always admire what's a little bit different. We don't want the same. And of course, over generations, these small degrees turn into what Darwin sees as the sort of kaleidoscopic variation of skin color, how people adorn themselves, how they shape their features among different societies all over the planet. It's exactly the same operation. And the effect of those catalogs, I think, is really destabilizing. He says that we would find that if all women were like the Venus de Milo, we'd be bored. And he's making a very specific argument there. This was I got this from Benjamin Morgan's book. He talks about, I forget the guy's name, Edinburgh Philosophical Society. Came up with all these sort of metrics on how the Venus de Milo was like the ideal form of human beauty. And I think Darwin has that very specifically in his sights. That he's dismantling any sense of an ideal norm of human beauty. And that's very powerful. He even has in his accounts of the way that other nations, races, their aesthetic categories, includes all these anecdotes of how disgusting, how people freaked out seeing white people. Right? They look hideous with their long teeth and their long noses. And again, he's sort of turning the mirror back on his Victorian readers, or I read it's posing kind of pedagogical challenge. Reader, can you see that you too are no less outlandish, right, than all these other varieties of human adornment and human beauty that he's describing?
Benjamin.
You can tell me the name of that.
Yeah, David Ramsey. Hey. Thank you so much for this really generative talk. I was really struck by your connection of time travel to a moral sense or a capacity for sympathy in George Eliot, Mill on the Floss. And I was thinking about how in Darwin's plots, Gillian Beer connects that kind of capacity to be on different timescales, not to a sense of the kind of dignity of a moral capacity, but almost a curse that we have as human beings. That she talks about these characters in Hardy who kind of envy these gnats that are flying around and are unaware of the tragedy of their lives that is going on around them. And so I was curious to hear you think a bit about how that capacity for multi-scalar temporality could not only be like a kind of good moral thing, but also something that's really a tragic condition for human beings.
Darwin finds himself reiterating, right, that what Buffon calls homo duplex in the Soins Naturels. It says that man has a double nature, and for him it's because reason is divinely implanted, but in every other way humans are like apes, and that keeps being done, in a sense, psychologizes it, right? The fact that if we don't obey this, that's obeying the social instinct, right? The enduring social instinct is hard, as in George Eliot. And of course, Mill on the Floss ends tragically. It ends with a kind of eruption of, quote, nature in the form of these sort of cyclical floods, as if it's probably as close to a sort of Hardy-esque plot as we find in George Eliot's novels. So yeah, an internal division, of course, is a topos of tragedy, right? All the way back to certainly Shakespeare, if not back to Sophocles. And I think Darwin sees that and knows that. And of course, it's a sign of the fall. But again, Darwin, I think, is making it generative and positive in the descent of man. He doesn't dwell so much on that tragic condition. He does also, I didn't mention this, I was guilty of streamlining my argument. He says it's there in other animals too. He talks about, swallows. If you put a swallow in a cage in the migration season, it will batter itself against the cage because of conflict of instincts. And he has other examples.
Great, thanks. This is a good lead into my question, which is about how much does it matter for your argument how much Darwin talks about non-human species in descent? Because he spends a lot of time on sexual selection in fish.
Fish and reptiles, yeah.
Yeah, and then this also connects to sort of, if you could draw out a little bit more your genre comparison between Darwin's Descent of Man and then, contemporary writers now like Diamond and Harari, who are very, very focused on humans. They're not thinking about fish to the same extent, for example.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And when I teach Darwin in literature courses, I hasten to add, generally, we read the first part of humans and then the sexual selection as opposed to man. We skip all the, which are wonderful, right? And again, it's part of these festive catalogues of aesthetic preferences for animals. I think the work they do is to underscore this decentering of what we, European Christian readers might recognize as the forms of beauty and think of as somehow unique, ideally embedded in our sort of organic systems. It works even more to destabilize and break those down. I briefly mentioned the book by Peter Godfrey Smith called Metazoa, which I found actually fascinating. Again, I'm reading it as an amateur, because it's a history of cognition that really is not about humans. I mean, his early book was on the octopus, right, as an intelligent creature very far removed from us in the evolutionary tree, the closest we can get on an terrestrial species to something like an alien life form. And he makes the argument that, all sorts of creatures have minds in all the ways that we define what a mind is. And the effect, again, is to radically decenter the sense that humans are the end and the center of natural history. And I think Darwin is doing something like that. And it calls the book The Descent of Man, punning on genealogical descent, but also it's not the ascent of man.
Patrick. This is.
Hi, thanks for that. That was wonderful. I have a question about the revival of what you might think of as ethical naturalism in the present. I'm thinking in part of the normative function of the Holocene in Anthropocene discourse, right? This sort of Goldilocks climate that gave rise to complex society. I'm also thinking of E.O. Wilson's notion of biophilia, right? Which in turn is now seriously considered as a political project of half Earth. There are even socialists who are embracing this, right? So out of an appreciation of nature, out of an appreciation of the relative stability of the Holocene climate, of its diversity, we derive a set of norms about human behavior, including an ethos of retreat, half Earth, right, pulling back, of restraint, and so forth. I don't think we're going to find that quite in Darwin, right? No, we will find it in Mill, I think. I think Mill's stationary state is a premonition of some of that.
Yeah, that's such a question. I'm reminded of reading Tom Hyams and other writers. They insist actually on this how chaotic and out of control the climate was. Is perhaps itself problematic. Yeah, I've just been reading, this is a bit of a tangent, but I mentioned Mill alongside Darwin. I've just finished reading a book I read a long time ago, The Malay Archipelago by Wallace, of course, the co-discoverer of natural selection. such an interesting book because he both has this kind of delighted response to the biodiversity and anthropological and ethnic diversity of the Indonesian archipelago, and at the same time is acutely aware of how fragile it is. Birds of paradise are already on the way to extinction. Modern human commerce and trade, it seems to have penetrated to just about every corner of it, including places that we might have thought of as being kind of remote, still wild or virgin in the mid-19th century. And he doesn't pronounce, I mean, he's sort of anxious about that, but I don't think we quite get to the point. I don't remember when we get the first proposals for what becomes, Yellowstone National Park. It's later, but people are thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a little bit later. I mean, it's there in a number of.
George Caitlin, I think in the 1830s or 40s, already talks about, goes out to the Great Plains and paints the Native Americans. He's already calling for what he calls the Indians are going, the frontier is disappearing, calls for what he calls it. I think he uses the phrase national park, in the sense that something ought to be preserved and isolated from human contamination. I don't think we said that in Darwin. He imagines, I think, this sort of ongoing spread of humanization of the planet. The politics of all this are very fraught, I think. I mean, there is a far right, ecological movement that has some really sort of dodgy sense of which human population ought to be maintained and which not.
I have lots of specific questions that I want to ask you, but I think I'll save them for later when we chat. One is about whether Freud's notion of the narcissism and fine differences could have come out of this view of Darwin that you're laying out here, because it looks like it's sort of, well, I guess, anyway. But instead of that, I wanted to take you back to your disciplinary claim or disclaimer at the beginning when you said you were reading Darwin like or as a literary scholar. So can you say a little more about what that means in the case of this talk? I mean, there's some references to Jane Austen, George Eliot. There's references to Schiller on plays. There's something about aesthetics going on here. Lots of talk about imagination. You're working closely with the text. But can you give more of a specificity to what you mean by that claim or disclaimer?
Sure. One sort of vulgar answer is that Darwin, the origin of species, the descent of man are written for a general Victorian. They're not like Darwin's treatises on barnacles, right, or orchids. He's not writing for specialists. They're attempts to speak to a broad Victorian, the same public that George Eliot and Dickens and J.S. Mill and Ruskin are speaking to. So in a way, I'm respecting that orientation of Darwin's own work as a literary work. And of course, to go back to the generation or two back, our Enlightenment philosophers are not specialists. I mean, Herder is synthesizing, or Kant for that matter, right, in the lectures on anthropology and related essays, is drawing upon discoveries in German life sciences, primarily in embryology, but is writing for a general European sort of republic of letters.
The conversible world, as Hume says, yeah.
Right. And I was just struck. I mean, Darwin's still claiming that readership. Of course, Darwin, this is an argument that James Moore and others make, that the professionalization of natural science is something that sort of happens after Darwin himself didn't have a professional position. He was writing from down house. In a sense, he has his feet in a kind of earlier institutional and disciplinary regime. He goes on the voyage of Beagle because his father pays for it, right? He's not, and he has a sort of little contretemps with the ship's naturalist, the doctor, right, who had, Janet Brown writes very well about this in her biography of Darwin, right, whose perquisite was that he would collect specimens for different social class. And here's this gentleman naturalist who's using Captain Fitzroy and all sorts of other resources to ship his specimens back to England. So I forget his name, he leaves the ship and they're in Brazil. So Darwin is this sort of fascinating figure because in some ways his feet are in a kind of earlier regime. And yeah, the argument has been made, and again, I'm not really able to assess it, that it's really the efforts of Huxley and co. to establish Darwin's theory, that they do so by a kind of professionalization in the next generation, or the generation after Darwin. So in some ways, what I'm doing is trying to recapture that sense of these works as works that speak to general readers. Darwin's is so interesting because, of course, he doesn't narrativize his argument in The Origin or in The Descent. And I think that is because Chambers's Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation is a massively popular bestseller, which Secord has written about, is trashed by reviewers, certain reviewers, because it's like a novel, it's a romance, right? It's conjectural history. And Darwin, I think, wants to avoid that. So we have to dig a bit to kind of piece together exactly what kind of conjectural history is actually going on in The Descent. I've been very interested by the recent waves of these works. I mean, Tom Higham is actually a professional scientist who figured out various kinds of DNA analysis of all kinds. I mean, the book is actually fascinating. I recommend it, The World Before Us. He's a guy who really sort of discovered the Denisovans from a tiny little bit of bone. Whereas some of these other authors are really, amateurs, journalists, synthesizing data they've taken from other fields. But it remains, I think, a really interesting, contested, what are the books that endeavor to speak to all of us and to offer these kind of universal truths, where did we come from? What does it mean that we became human? And why those questions seem to become more urgent at certain historical moments, such as our historical moment now.
Alison Winter was very interested in the literary Darwin.
Uh-huh.
We did an independent reading in which she took up the question of why Darwin was carrying a copy of Paradise Lost around
and
the Beagle.
Yeah.
And she spent several weeks, one quarter, explaining that to me.
Oh, wow.
I learned a lot.